It's finally here. Hello everyone, Miles98 here today with a brand new video. Today we'll be reviewing the book Black Skin, White Mask by Dr. Frantz Fanon. Now, if you watched my last video, you already have an idea of who Fanon was. But if you haven't, I suggest that you watch the video. The link will be down in the description below. Now, the reason I chose to review this book is because I have been wanting to do some videos on psychology for a while, as that is my major, and I think the field of psychology hasn't been well looked into from a Marxist standpoint for quite some time. So, why not start off with Fanon? His works on the psychological mindset of the colonized and colonizers are often held in high regard in revolutionary circles, making it quite useful for us to learn something from it. Now, this video will be broken up into 5 separate parts, with part 1 being chapters 1 through 3, part 2 being chapters 4 through 6, part 3 being chapter 7 and its subsections, part 4 being chapter 8, and lastly, part 5 being the conclusion and my final thoughts on this work. Now, without further ado, let us finally begin this book review. Chapter 1 is titled The Black Man and Language, and right off the bat, there is a quote that speaks to me. The black man possesses 2 dimensions, one with his fellow blacks, the other with the whites. The black man behaves differently with a white man than he does with another black man. There is no doubt whatsoever that this fissurporousness, I know I did not pronounce that right, I apologize, is a direct consequence of the colonial undertaking. Nobody dreams of challenging the fact that its principal inspiration is nurtured by the core of theories which represent the black man as the missing link in the slow evolution from ape to man. These are objective facts that states reality. We can see here the hard-hitting fact that blacks in society often have to act differently around white people rather than themselves or around other black people. The most prominent example that comes to mind is the use of AAVE, or African American Vernacular English. This brand of English is a dialect within the New African community, but due to discrimination it is often called as slang and broken English. Notice how when someone uses AAVE language such as, "You better get your ass in here," or "You been knowing they on some bullshit," it is often treated like bad English when in reality it is a dialect that is believed to have formed from Creole that converged from English. Slaves learning English from indentured servants who themselves spoke a poor or not proficient English, with the latter theory being most accepted by linguists. This dialect grew under slavery and segregation, and to this day it is often used by both New Africans and non-New Africans. When people do speak this dialect, they are seen as ignorant, unprofessional, or just lazy. This is just one way of how black people have to act in front of white people. This just doesn't affect New Africans or just black people. This affects anyone that speaks a dialect or a language within a country that has a chauvinist view of their own language being superior. Few examples include the following: Kurdish, Assyrian, Catalan, Basque, and Belarusian, to name a few. For Fanon, it was in his home country of the French Antillean, as the black people tried to assimilate with the French language in order to be seen as human beings. For if he doesn't speak the language of his colonizer, but his own dialect, he will be seen as a barbarous Negro. The colonized know this, and they want to be seen as a human being, and not second-class citizens. Quote, "All colonized people, in other words, people in whom an inferiority complex has taken root, whose local cultural originality has been committed to the grave position themselves in relation to the civilizing language, i.e. the metropolitan culture, the more the colonized has assimilated the cultural views of the metropolis, the more he will have escaped the bush, the more he rejects his blackness in the bush, the whiter he will become." We have seen this in people before. They are either ashamed of their culture or wish to be part of the dominant culture. They give up their identity. Bill Cosby being a great example, often rejecting black culture for a more bourgeois variant of it. While some of his critiques can be valid, mainly the reactionary half of black culture, his attack on the New African community is often itself reactionary, blaming us for all our ails and belittling our creative culture, since we do not match the white man's status of being fully integrated within the bourgeois system. This of course breeds self-hatred more than it does encouragement. Whilst the upper class of the black community that is often disconnected from the proletariat class of the black community will agree with Cosby and support this due to them not being conscious that he represents the bourgeois interest, the black working class will often be appalled by this, as they understand their conditions is not entirely their fault. Now, another example of self-hatred I like to bring up is Rafael Trujillo, the former fascist dictator of the Dominican Republic. A man of mixed race, he had a deep hatred for the Haitian people. Despite the fact that his grandparents was of Haitian descent, he found them to be backwards and inferior. This form of self-hatred revealed itself in the most abhorrent way possible of the 1937 Parsley Massacre, where 20,000 Haitians that lived near the border were murdered. He claimed that the Dominican Republic was a white nation with a Hispanic culture. You see, when one has a disliking of their native culture, either one of two things will happen. One, this self-hatred will lead to reactionary thinking. Such thinking includes self-hatred, total contempt for one's own people, wanting to distance themselves from their own identity, as we have seen with Cosby and Trujillo, or they could be inspired with a progressive view of fixing their culture to fit an international one that focuses on uplifting the masses, as we have seen with Mao and Lenin. For one to have a self-hatred for one's own group, since it does not match the others, is what leads to reactionary thinking, and such thinking will lead to a desire for the degenerate ideology known as fascism. Black man entering France changes because for him, the metropole is the holy of holies. He changes not only because that's where his knowledge of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire comes from, but also because that's where his doctors, his departmental superiors, and innumerable little potentats come from the staff sergeant, 15 years on the job, to the gendarme from Panacea. There's a kind of spell cast from afar, and the black man who leaves in 1 week for the metropole creates an aura of magic around him where the words Paris, Marseille, the Sorbonne, and Pigalle represent the high points. We can see that when one goes to the so-called promised land, they form this new perception of how they should act. They feel they have learned something new, and that the way he once acted was something abominable. Of course, the way he once acted was the original culture of the colonized people, without looking at it through a dialectical lens, i.e. not looking at what is progressive and what is reactionary. He throws the baby out with the bathwater and forms a negative self-image of his own culture and views the people within that culture as lesser. Quote, in fact, the newly returned Martinican adopts a language different from that of the community in which he was born is evidence of a shift and a split. Professor Westerman writes in The African Today that the feeling of inferiority by blacks is especially evident in the educated black man who is constantly trying to overcome its language. The method used, Westerman adds, is often naive. Quote, the wearing of European clothes, whether rags or the most up-to-date style, using European furniture and European forms of social intercourse, adorning the native language with European expressions, using bombastic phrases in speaking or writing a European language. All of these contribute to a feeling of equality with the European and its achievements. End quote. The man becomes alienated from his own culture, and a dialect is formed between him and his people. He becomes alienated from the masses of his own people, and even the masses of the dominant culture/society. For the culture the educated black man adopts is one of the bourgeois outlook on life, and what he learns from the colonizer's culture is how bourgeois life is lived in that culture, and that things are just as fine as they are. This again does not only happen to black people, but anyone of a colonized background, as I explained earlier. This usually affects those with a petite or haute bourgeois background, but it can seep its way to the proletariat, infecting them with defeatism, nihilism, and of course, self-hatred. Or it can push them away from these views, but will lead them to opportunistic views of pork-chop nationalism, metaphysics, and identity opportunism. Only through engaging with the masses and teaching them Marxist philosophy can we steer them away from these infectious diseases that threatens to poison them. It should also be pointed that education is not the problem per se, but where that education comes from. We live in a bourgeois system that promotes a bourgeois point of view, and no matter how many times they try to add things to appease minorities, black literature, gender studies, or women's history, is only to obfuscate the origin of where these struggles stem from: capital. Of course, we should not have a one-sided view of this, but we can use what we learn in the bourgeois system against it. By eschewing the useless information we are taught, we can find kernels of truth that can be used to agitate, and even as a gateway to look deeper at a certain event to educate the masses in order to fight off this parasitic system. It is when the student of the bourgeois institution doesn't use what they are taught against the system, but instead uses it to perpetuate the system at hand. I am not arguing from changing the system from within, but to use it to apply to the struggle. Speaking of education, quote, when another desperately tries to prove to me that the black man is as intelligent as any white man, my response is that neither did intelligence save anybody. For if equality among men is proclaimed in the name of intelligence and philosophy, it is also true that these concepts have been used to justify the extermination of man. End quote. The intelligence of said person doesn't matter. The fact that person X can be as intelligent as person Y does not matter in the long run. What matters is the treatment of said person. The last group of people to openly put emphasis of one group of people over another committed a mass genocide of quote-unquote undesirables. We should not base our society on intelligence, race, sexuality, or ethnicity, but that of class. Yet it is not in the interests of either the bourgeois to look at life as a class struggle. It is for the best to look at life with a metaphysical lens in order to keep people guessing what causes all these ailments. We see this when people openly attack set groups such as the Jews, Muslims, blacks, Kurds, Yazidi, Latino Americans, and so on. Yet, they never, nor will they ever be encouraged to, look at the internal contradictions within society, but always the external. Even if they are told to look from within, it is told to them by people that benefit from the system, and the actions they are told to take is by peaceful protest, voting, and other nonsensical things that won't bring real change. Throughout different societies, today and in history, we have seen ailments be blamed on not only by the ruling class, excluding a handful, but by other groups. The colonized are no different, for we too are often targets for reactionary hatred, as we are often blamed for society's problems. So intelligence means nothing when it comes to real issues. But the awareness of class interest is what matters. Fanon even mentions in the next 2 pages that we are not trying to appeal to humanity of our feelings of dignity, love, and charity, but that it is not our purpose. For what we are truly striving for is the liberation of the black man. I'll even add on to this, we are for the liberation of all oppressed peoples, and most importantly, the oppressed workers of the world, to free them from all old thought, old traditions, and everything that keeps the masses down. The next issue of culture he brings up is a constant talking down to the racial minority. He gives an example of how, in visiting the doctor, a European person is treated like an adult, but with the racial minority, they are treated as children. This use of language reminds the minority group that they are materially inferior. Despite the fact that they are grown, they are still treated as if they are a child due to their poor conditions. This is a good thing to know in general. We have all seen the stereotypical liberal white person talking to oppressed people as if they are a frail child, but this reinforces the mindset of them being lesser. The majority group, and even the other minority groups, must treat each other with proper respect as if the person they are talking to is an intelligent adult. Might some spout some reactionary nonsense? Yes. Does that mean we treat them as children? No. To struggle with people means to treat them as if they are capable of thinking logically, and even reach the correct conclusions. We can challenge them, critique them, and so on, but we must never treat them like kids. To do so is disrespecting them, and reinforces this abhorrent view of the masses being unable to ever understand anything. When we meet someone that doesn't understand, we patiently, yet firmly, correct their incorrect view and help them walk through it. So, we have seen how language helps reinforce the idea that material reality is viewed by the colonized people. What about the women of the colonized world? Chapter 2 goes over that by talking about the women of color and the white man. Quote, in understanding phenomena of this order, the analysis and the phenomenologists have a tough job, and although we have sought for portraying failed love, being a nothingness is but the analysis of bad faith and inauthenticity. The fact remains, nevertheless, that true love, real love, i.e., wishing for others what one postulates for oneself, when this postulate integrates the permanent values of human reality, requires the mobilization of psychological agencies liberated from the unconscious tension. Quote, for after all, when we read, I am a Martican woman, subquote, I would have liked to marry, but with a white man. Only a colored woman is never quite respectable in the eyes of a white man. Even if he loves her, I knew well. End of subquote. We have every right to be concerned. This excerpt, that, in a sense, brings to a culmination a huge mystification, is food for thought. One day, a woman by the name of Mayot Capisa, sorry if I mispronounced, obeying a motivation whose reasons are difficult to grasp, sat down and wrote 202 pages on her life in which the most ridiculous ideas proliferated at random. The enthusiastic reception the book had received in certain circles obliges us to analyze it. For us, there is no doubt whatsoever that I Am a Martican Woman is a third rate book advocating unhealthy behavior. The unhealthy behavior lies within the subconscious, meaning what on the outside might seem fine, but on the inside of the person's thoughts, a certain view of reality is being formed by how society works. Art is a reflection of society, and what reflects materiality will be reinforced to the people. Art does not exist in a void. It can influence a person, hence why propaganda is so powerful. It doesn't take a movie snob to notice that movies often reflect the reality we live in, regardless of it being fantasy, sci-fi, or so on. It is often a commentary on reality and pushes a certain ideology. For the most part, today, art represents the interests of the capitalist, and not only the capitalist, but a certain norm. Here, the subconscious view is that being pushed is the beauty of the white man. Now, of course, there is nothing wrong with a black woman loving a white man, but the issue lies within a context this narrative is being pushed. Fanon rewrites this paragraph and analyzes it. Goyette loves that white man because he had blue eyes, blonde hair, and pale skin. Fanon states that in this book, Mayoette's character treats this man like a god, and that she demands nothing but, quote, a little whiteness in her life, end quote. Fanon himself also notes that this form of inferiority has historically been felt as an economic problem, as Mariette's character is dazzled by the riches of her love interest. She is even brought to the villas, a place she had dreamed of going to as a child. Yet, when she dressed up for it and was treated differently, she didn't feel like herself. She assumed it had to do with the color of her skin. Now, Fanon states that all of their Creole beauty's desires are turned toward Dider, an upper-class area of the capital of the French Antilles, making the native parts seem undesirable. This is further extrapolated when it is revealed that she knew about Fort-de-France, the capital, when she was 18, yet she knew about the villas at Dider when she was a kid. She contradicts herself. When contextualized, Fanon tells us that this is common amongst the Martinican people to dream of whitening themselves up. So, we see the view of wanting to become white being pushed within this book. This view is often hard to spot by those that don't have a critical eye, but when we look at media with a class distinct eye, we begin to take note of certain tropes and messages that even perhaps the creator themselves were unaware of pushing, as some of these views have been ingrained in us. We begin to see we should value this and dislike that, but not being fully aware we are being taught that. This is one reason why we tend to value certain things in both media and real life, as the art reflects the material and material of the art reinforces, or seldom challenges the way we think. Quote, I am white. In other words, I embody beauty and virtue, which have never been black. I am the color of day. I am black. I am in total fusion with the world, in the sympathetic affinity with the earth, losing my id in the heart of the cosmos, and the white man, however intelligent he may be, is incapable of understanding Louis Armstrong or songs from the Congo. I am black, not because of a curse, but because my skin has been able to capture all the cosmic effluvia. I am truly a drop of sun under the earth, end quote. We see the contradictions of the two people. One is seen as superior, whilst the other, despite having history, culture, and so on, is seen as inferior. They are not human. We are either black or white, human or animal. There is no in between. Even if there was a synthesification and the mulatto is born, they are forced to still choose to be white or black. One contradiction must overpower the other. The bourgeois conception of race has its roots in the ownership of the means of production. In this case, due to the white Europeans having ownership of the black, yellow, red, and so on means of production, siphoning the resources for profit, a view of superiority had been formed. Since the colonized are seen as weak and backwards due to them either just reaching feudalism and having traditions that didn't fit the colonizers' view of morality, they are seen as weaker, dumber, and someone that can be taken advantage of. This dangerous view will be pushed to even the colonized people in order to keep them subdued. There is a reason why, during the time of colonial Africa, they were not taught their own history, but mainly European history. It was to erase their culture and make them accept the false view of them being inferior. This worldview has persisted even after the colonies gained independence. We can see this in Mayody's book. Due to years of being put down, she had developed a psychological view of what a black Martican woman is and what she should want. Now, whether she was aware of this or not, she would end up writing a book that still perpetuates that the Martican black woman should still seek to be white. We have been forewarned. Mayodi is striving for ratification. In a word, the race must be whitened. Every woman in Martinique knows this, says this, and reiterates it. Whiten the race, save the race, but not along the lines as you might think. Do not safeguard the originality of that part of the world in which they grew up, but ensure its whiteness. Bill Cosby, Herman Cain, Anthony Brian Logan, all examples of black people wanting blacks to be white and reject everything that is black in culture, even the progressive aspects. Quote, every time we have wanted to analyze certain kinds of behavior, we have come up against some nauseating phenomena. The number of phrases, proverbs, and pickup lines a lover in the Antilles chooses is extraordinary. The crux of the problem is not to slip back among the nigger rabble, and any Antillean woman in her flirtations and her liaisons will prefer the lighter skinned man. The woman, and even the man, is taught to seek someone that is educated, professional, and well respected. They are often filled with images of a white person. Even if today such images can be applied to anyone of any color, the dominant culture, still being Eurocentric, will still push that these qualities are that of a white person. This is more damaging to that of the colored woman than that of the colored man. In American society, being a black woman has a psychological toll on her. The black woman is often told through the media that she can only be beautiful if she looks white or has light skin. They often are socially invisible. As when a study of women's issues was conducted, it was disproportionate research of white women rather than that of women of color. And whilst movements such as Black is Beautiful, the Me Too movement, and Black Lives Matter has helped in black women getting heard, the real cure of their ailments will never be fixed until capitalism has been overthrown and replaced with socialism based on the teachings of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. Until then, the colonized woman is damned for the color of her skin, the sex she was born into, and most importantly, what class she is a part of. In Chapter 3, Fanon goes over more authors and the experience of colored men and white women, but I'll only focus on two things within this section. One of the things Fanon had noticed was that in his recent conversations with Italian men, he had learned that the main preoccupation they had was setting foot on France and to sleep with a white woman. So they would barely get off the ship of Le Havre, and they would head down to the bordellos, which were the brothels, and once they had achieved this ritual of initiation into authentic manhood, they would proceed to take the train to Paris. To sleep with a woman of a different race has often been the goal of many perverted people as they fetishize the people of said race. This was no different for the Italian men, that were subconsciously taught that sleeping with a Parisian woman was the key to become a man. With this, we see two issues. 1. Seeing white women as the pinnacle of beauty. 2. The fetishization of people. Now, one, we have already earlier discussed the issues of promoting one race of women as the pinnacle of beauty over the other in the previous subpart. But this time we see how it affects the males. The men of Martinique are being pushed towards a specific heteronormative view that if you manage to sleep with or even marry a white woman, you have hit the jackpot. This, of course, stems with the fact that white people in the Antilles Islands are seen as the most well off of people. Of course, this is again pushed in order to keep the spirits of the colonized down so they will only have a negative view of themselves, which in turn hurts any revolutionary potential. Now, that isn't to say that the white man is okay with this. Remember, the colonized then, and still to this day, are seen as lesser. And when a colored man back then was caught sleeping with a white woman, they are often castrated. We will get into that part later. And hanged. This perpetual state of promoting white beauty but denying the colonized from ever having this made them view the women of the white race as no longer human, but a prized object. This leads to our next issue. When it comes to dehumanizing a person, there are multiple ways of doing so. Whether that be a constant comparing them to that of a beast, making them out as a taboo sexual figure, overtly sexualizing them to the point where they are only seen as sexual objects, or so on, we begin to see these people as no longer humans, but objects. This is a form of fetishization. When the black men of Martinique were being constantly taught subconsciously through the propaganda of the colonizer that white skin was the ultimate form of beauty, they would no longer see the white women as human beings. As Fanon mentioned, when the black men went to France, they would often visit the brothels to sleep with white women in order to achieve this authentic manhood. The men didn't sleep with them because they were lonely or that they loved them, but only because they were this object they had to use in order to become not only a man, but a man of high status. Now, of course, the colonized people were also fetishized and still are to this day, but the point being here is that it is a two-way streak which causes a myriad of psychological issues of how these people will view each other. Quote, my fellow native Martikian is not as beautiful as the white people. If I were white, I would have a better life. The white women and white men are the most beautiful creatures on the planet. I want to marry, have sex with, and want children with these white people, because that means my life will get better. If I marry, have sex with, and have children with these white people, I will be admired and glorified by my fellow native Martikians. I will be seen as on the same level with the white people. End quote. With thoughts like these, we will continue to see a growth of genuine self-hatred among the people that are not whites. Let us start off with a quote that might be misunderstood. Quote, in order to demonstrate that racism is not a reflection of the economic situation, the author reminds us that, quote, in South Africa, the white laborers are quite as racialist as the employers and managers, and very often a good deal more so, end quote. This quote is about a passage he goes over, and it can easily be misunderstood as him saying race does not stem from class, which isn't the case. Prior to the quote given, France is going over how it is idealist to say that one form of prejudice exists in one circle and not the other, that if it does exist in one circle and the other, one is lesser than the other. Whilst racism does stem from class, it is no way exclusive from one class. He further extrapolates on this on the next page, where he asks the author of the passage whether or not if the form of anti-Semitism a Jew faces in Maurras, sorry if I mispronounced that, is any different from the anti-Semitism of Goebbels. The point being is this, racism and other forms of prejudice are the same, whether they come from the ruling class or the workers, and whether or not on how violent and oppressive it is. It still pushes a reactionary view of reality that must be combated. On page 68, Fanon continues to go over Manoy's, the author of the passage he is going over. Next mistake, Manoy claimed that the colonial exploitation is not the same as other forms of exploitation, and that colonial racism is different from other kinds of racialism. Here we see the metaphysical and possible postmodernist view that there are different types of racism. Needless to say, there are no quote-unquote different forms of racism. If a person upholds a general prejudice, views a race of people, and wishes to have power over said race, and or if that person upholds that one race is inferior or superior to another, they are by definition racist. Fanon says that he, Manoy, is speaking of phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and human brotherhood, but France implores him to give more concrete terms. France retorts by saying, quote, all forms of exploitation are alike. They all seek to justify their existence by citing some biblical decree. All forms of exploitation are identical, since they apply to the same quote-unquote object, man. By considering the structure of such and such an exploitation from an abstract point of view, we are closing our eyes to the fundamentally important problem of restoring man to his rightful place. End quote. Exploitation of man may come in different forms, but it seeks to reduce man to that of an object. They are only there for use, and so that to whom is ever exploiting them can gain the value they produce. That is, it takes away the humanity of said person and makes them an object. So he is correct in saying that all forms of exploitation are alike, as they all lead to the same result. But what about its justification, one might ask? There are various forms of excuses and exploitations of exploitation. Whether they use their religion to justify it, bourgeois philosophy, or other forms of flimsy excuses, we still see that all of it is nothing more than a despicable way of wanting to extract the value of others. There are no examples of where exploiting a person is a good thing. The colonized people were exploited for their labor, like the proletariat of a colonizer nation. To reiterate, there are different forms and ways of exploiting people, but the end result is to extract their value and reduce the person to nothing more but a mere object. Let us move on to the next part where Fanon illuminates a very important piece of information that goes without saying. Superiorization is the native correlative to the European's feeling of superiority. Let us have the courage to say, it is the racist who creates the inferiorized. Needless to say, this passage tells us an important point that we know deep down, but never said it out loud. No one in their right mind will go about in life and say they are inferior to other people without being aware of something superior. There is no a priori that gives the special wisdom of already knowing who is superior and who is inferior. This form of knowing, like all forms of knowledge, stems from practice, which we do in the material world that is ruled by the laws of dialectics. Where the idea of the superior and inferiority come from is that based on the material conditions, and the dialectics of one thing being the opposite of the other. Throughout history, man has had a constant misunderstanding of what makes one weak and strong. Usually they attribute this to a form of idealism, whether it came from the gods or it was destiny. They would often ignore the material conditions that had given them an advantage. In truth, there is no such thing as a superior or inferior human beings, as it lacks the nuance of what is considered superior or inferior. But there are superior and inferior material conditions depending on what is being used. For example, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, China had inferior weaponry compared to the Japanese weaponry. China was a backwards feudal nation, while Japan was becoming an imperialist power. Yet, as the war went on, Japan was losing to China despite them having a superior weaponry. Why is that? Was it because the spirits favored the Chinese over the Japanese, or that the Chinese people were superior to the Japanese people? No. The guerrillas of the Communist Party had used a protracted warfare method that based itself in the three stages: defensive, equilibrium, and offensive. With the understanding of their material conditions, themselves, and their foes, they managed to beat the Japanese army. What is the moral of the lesson here? What we call inferior in one aspect can be superior in another, and these aspects can change given the proper education. We see this with the IQ arguments. Despite that IQ is metaphysical, it is often used to justify disparaging black people. That they do not take into account is the material conditions that influence this, and that these traits are not eternal but can change, as it is a dialectic. The people that saw themselves to be superior are the ones that push these negative connotations on people, using the flimsiest of logics and supporting this idealist notion of racial superiority. Now, this idea of superiority, of course, still permeates in today's society from country to country, and of course, this leads to the self-hatred I mentioned earlier. This can also create dependent behavior. The colonized or racially discriminated must know their place and act certain ways in order to be accepted. They cannot act as if they are equal to the so-called superior. They must be quote-unquote one of the good ones. This is the basis for the inferiority complex when it comes to the racially discriminated. We can see this even in today's America. Despite the fact there is a rising conscience of black pride, there are still people that play the token role. And whilst these token Negroes have black skin, they wear a poorly cut out white mask to let the white man know that he is one of the good Negroes but still inferior to him. When living in a society that promotes a form of chauvinism that contradicts a person's own identity, we will see this contradiction intensify until one overpowers the other, and in these cases, the chauvinism will win by eliminating the identity of the other group, or the group that is subjected to this chauvinism will rebel and create their own distinct identity. One will overpower the other, but there is an important, distinct matter that should not be ignored. If class is left out of the equation, the revolt of the people who are subjected to the chauvinism of the ruling class could become another reactionary force, and whilst one group no longer suffers, the others will. And this will create a new contradiction that will need to be resolved. To correctly solve this contradiction for the benefit of for the people of just not that one group, we must have a Marxist analysis of this issue. Understand such reactionary notions stem from class, and are often pushed by the ruling class to divide the workers. Only then can we have a proper resolvement of this contradiction. Quote, ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the black man, since it ignores lived experience. For not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. Some people will argue that the situation has double meaning. Not at all. The black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. From one day to the next, the blacks have had to deal with two systems of reference: their metaphysics, or less pretentiously, their customs and the agencies to which they refer, were abolished because they were in contradiction with a new civilization that opposed its own. End quote. Now, whilst this passage does suffer from empiricism, the lived experience of a black man is unique, as any lived experience of any said person of any said group. What he means for a black man to be black is for the black person to be conscious of the race that bourgeois society has labeled him. Thus, he will begin to understand the contradiction between him and his white counterparts. Whilst the white counterpart can and will face struggles of their own related to class, they will never have the exact same struggle as the colored man. The white man does not need to fear for his life over the color of his skin, but the colored folk must. The white man can go anywhere in the country where he pleases, but the colored folk still needs to be careful to which area they dare go. The white man will most likely be given the benefit of the doubt, but the colored man has a snowball chance in hell. I will go even further and say the person who becomes conscious with this is on the right path in understanding contradictions in one part of the issues of society. But if they do not look at the branch from where this wretched dialect comes from and see the root of the problems, class, they will be damned to metaphysical thinking. As for the system we face, what he means here is the contradictory aspect of culture. The culture of the colonized versus the colonizer is always something that comes at odds with each other. What one group is used to doing, the other isn't, and depending on how drastically different said thing is, one can have violently negative reactions to it. Now, since black culture is diverse, i.e., New African, Caribbean, and Afro-Latino, etc., since I am more familiar with New African culture than the others I just named, we will use this as an example. In the New African community, I had mentioned we have a dialect called the AAVE. Granted, it is not universally spoken and still has yet to be recognized as a dialect by the bourgeois government, it is still part of our cultural identity. Needless to say, it is not looked on by society as a good thing, as we are shamed that we speak it, and is often used to describe us as ignorant niggers. For most of us, code switching between culture to culture isn't hard, but it is quite annoying to constantly code switch not because we are interested in said culture or learn it, but because said culture is promoted as quote unquote educated and quote unquote clean and other nonsense is quite damaging to the psyche of the people. But I have already been over this, and again, this is not to say New African culture has reactionary elements that must be purged, but the entire culture itself does not deserve to be belittled. Quote, I was not mistaken, it was hatred. I was hated, detested, and despised, not by my next door neighbor or a close cousin, but by an entire race. I was up against something irrational. The psychoanalysts say that there is nothing more traumatizing for a young child than contact with the rational. I personally would say that for a man armed solely with reason, there's nothing more neurotic than contact with the irrational. End quote. When one comes into contact with a negative interaction with people and it is based upon their race, sexuality, gender, or ethnicity, one can get the feeling that the entire group of that said person is a part of hates that person. This can indeed be traumatizing for said person. This can lead to one developing a reactionary view against these people, so instead of thinking logically, they all think and believe said group to be horrible people and cannot be trusted. Whilst there are legitimate reasons for these people to hate those that oppress them, it is often best to understand who we are aiming our hatred at. Is it at the ruling class that benefits from the masses hating each other and not them? Or is it the section of the masses that are backwards due to their material conditions and the lies they have been fed to all these years? Sure, we can hate the people that called us horrific names and oppressed us for years, but will that solve the issues of inequality, sexism, or racism? No. Those issues stem from class differences, as I explained before. When one exploits another for labor, the exploiter will often have metaphysical thinking as to why this is justifiable. From race to sex, gender to sexuality, they will always make idealist excuses. We cannot afford to have this hatred for another group of people that too face exploitation. For a while, I have seen some identity opportunists make such horrendous claims that said group of ethnic people cannot be revolutionary due to their skin color. Since people of said group tend to benefit a bit from the system, keyword being a bit, they don't fully benefit from imperialism. They face economic hardships and everyday struggles like everyone else. Up next is a quote that is quite well known. Quote, it was my philosophy teacher from the Antilles who reminded me one day, when you hear someone insulting the Jews, pay attention. He is talking about you. This rings true for any forms of prejudice. If you hear anyone making fun of the Jews and you are a part of an oppressed group, they are also making fun of you. If they hate the Jews, what makes you think they like you? Look at yourself, think about who you are, and take note of anything about yourself that isn't fully or flat out not accepted by your society. Are you a Negro? then they are making fun of you for your supposed lack of intelligence. Are you gay? The person that is ridiculing the Negro for their supposed lack of intelligence is ridiculing you for you being a supposed perverted freak. Are you trans? The person that is ridiculing the gay person for being perverted is making fun of you and calling you a pedophilic freak. When one person is ridiculed for their ethnicity, sex, gender, sexuality, religion, or so on, what makes you think they will not turn on you? Reactionary thinking is illogical, but it also leads to a path where one hatred for one group can lead to another. Quote, the white family is the guardian of a certain structure. Society is the sum of all families. The family is an institution, precursor of a much wider institution, i.e., the social group or nation. The main lines of reference remain the same. The white family is the educating and training ground for entry into society. Quote, the family structure is internalized in the superego, Marcus says, and projected into political, though I would say social behavior, end quote. The family, of course, has its origins around property of production and reproduction, as Ingalls explained, and when a certain type of family model has fit a model to serve the ruling elite, it becomes the model. In this case, it is the settler family. This is, of course, not to negate the class struggle, but the, quote, ideal family structure based on culture, in this case, Yankee culture, is pushed upon the colonized family structure. The psychological effect of the new familial structure is to impose a sense of superiority over the non-favored structure. Today, most people are aimed to have a two-parent, 2 to 3 children household and a stable job. Yes, some things have changed over time, but the nuclear family model is still preferred, at least in American culture. For someone who doesn't have this familial lifestyle, it might have a negative effect, and this doesn't only affect the POC, but white people as well. But for a family that is a part of a group that is already oppressed can lead to further feelings of inferiority, which lead down to darker paths. Fanon gives an example of a black kid living his own life, and he shows us that if the black kid lives his life in his environment, he will not think twice or feel inferior. After all, this is his culture. Anywhere he looks, the people that look like him live like this, therefore they will not feel bad or useless for this life. They will live similar to how a white kid never feels bad for the life they have and never give it a second thought. Now put this black kid in France. He will have a different view of his life. He will not only feel different and out of place, but also inferior, due to the fact this environment has always had a way of living that is not only different, but more rich. And in that society, they look down on people like that black kid, since their family structure is seen as poor and incorrect. Fanon points out that the structure itself was built to make that person feel inferior. The bourgeois system seeks to maintain itself. If it can set up this supposed perfect family structure, it can fill the bourgeois needs of the Yankee identity. Now this only helped the Euro-Americans, and even then it only helped ones that managed to become middle class. This structure was to show that in order to live happily, you must be white, straight, and have a good job. Of course, this view is static and anti-dialectical as well as anti-masses. The view of the family has only helped support a reactionary viewpoint of reality, trying to individualize the family as separate and not communal. It is alienating to man. Now throw in race and you got yourself a shit stir-fry. The increasing alienation between the races helps keep the masses at each other's throats. Have one section feel superior to the other, and the wretched kings have no fear of losing their heads. Have the masses come together, and the kings cower under their beds. Whilst the white family may be the most model structure in certain countries, itself has its roots not based on race, but on the social structure of the relation of the means of production. The race of which the family is modeled after is no more than a byproduct of the colonial structure that stems from capital. If the situation was reversed, it would still have the same rotten root, capital. Quote, we have said that the black man is phobogenic. What is phobia? Our answer will be based on the latest book by Esnau. Quote, phobia is a neurosis characterized by the anxious fear of an object, in the broadest sense of anything outside the individual, or by the extension of a situation. End of quote. Naturally, such an object must take on certain aspects. It must, says Esnau, arouse fear and revulsion. But here we encounter a problem. Applying the genetic method of the understanding of phobia, Charles O'Dea writes, quote, all anxiety derives from a certain subjective insecurity linked to the absence of the mother, end quote. This occurs, according to O'Dea, somewhere around the second year, end quote. Ignoring the Freudian nonsense of mothers being the sole issue, let's examine what he means. When people feel anxious, it stems from a source or origin. whether that be from a past traumatic experience or a minor unpleasant feeling that said person experienced, can carry on as how they will interact with others or said thing. Black men during this time, and still somewhat today, tend to feel nervous when around non-black people. But what caused this? It is normal to feel some form of anxiety when in a new environment, but this form of anxiety is not like being in a new school or a new neighborhood. This form of anxiety comes from a social historical background. We see how we are often treated by non-blacks and are often disregarded. Now, that being said, we have grown accustomed to a certain level of uneasiness and fear surrounding certain groups of people. This fear, if untreated, can lead to a fear of the whole instead of a fear of the few. This generalization, as I pointed out before, will lead to a more ignorant standpoint from the person that is at the hands of suffering. This ignorance will reinforce the ignorance of the majority and create a dialect between them. So instead of rectification, there is a growing antagonism. This is why we fight to rectify this, so ignorant actions don't lead to the masses fighting each other. As I have stated a plethora of times before, the enemy is the ruling elite and not the other masses. On the next few pages, he gives a psychoanalytic understanding of why the black man is seen as inferior. He states that this isn't a universal view, but a subjective one. We as Negroes are seen as, well, by races, biologically sexually superior, i.e. big penises, athletic, powerful, savages, animalistic, and sinful. He compares this to how Jews are usually seen by anti-Semites, which is land-owning, the killer of Christ, money grubbers, and so on. If you know anything about the history of killing black folk, you would know that white men would always cut off their penises. Yeah, the animalistic nature we have been assigned by the ruling elite in the past made us out to be sexual beings that want to fuck everything we see. Why is it when the Jews are killed they are never castrated? It is because of the reasons listed above, as the oppressors labeled them as the following examples I had given. To the racists, they, the Jews, aren't sexually perverse, or at least not at the same level as a black man, but they are seen as a calculating group pulling the strings. Now, this is of course metaphysical line of reasoning for hating a group of people, but as we know, reactionaries thinking is mostly based on metaphysics. Materially speaking, there is not much difference between the races, but this is obscured by toxic masculinity, years of being lied about and to, as well as the reinforcement of metaphysical thinking within a capitalist society. So remember, whenever you think about black men having huge members, that stems from a racist stereotype that we are sexually savage creatures that cannot think. In Chapter 7, Fanon proceeds to use different methodologies of different psychologists and philosophers to analyze the mindset. He first begins with Alfred Adler. Now, before I go on, for those of you that don't know who Alfred Adler is, he was a psychologist that termed the coin and theorized superior complex, inferior complex, and individual psychology. For Adler, motivation for people stemmed from inferiority and wanting to be better, whilst the vice versa is a superiority complex. Of course, this is all metaphysical, but let us see what Fanon has to say. The Lamarckians are hungry for reassurance. They want their wishful thinking to be recognized. They want their wish for virility thinking to be recognized. They want to flaunt themselves. Each and every one of them constitutes an isolated, arid, assertive atom along well-defined rites of passage. Each of them is. Each of them wants to be, wants to flaunt himself. Every act of an Antillean is dependent on the so-called other, not because the so-called other remains his final goal for the purpose of communing with him as described by Adler, but simply because it is the so-called other who asserts him in his need to enhance his status, end quote. Needless to say, the Lamarckians, according to Adler, were suffering from an inferiority complex. Now, is the mentality of feeling inferior a thing? I would say it is, and of course it is damaging, but like everything in existence, it stems from a material being. In this case, the material conditions of the Lamarckians were poor, with poor living standards and the fruits of their labor being siphoned by the capitalist class, along with other issues, had framed an inferior view of the Lamarckians. Now, of course, the Lamarckians did not have a class conscience, or at least most of them had not, and they wanted to be the same wealth as the upper class. Fanon states that the issue with the Aldrin view is that the psychology of the individual does not match the psychology of the Lamarckian people. He states that these issues do not stem from the soul but the environment. He also seems to take note that for something to be inferior, there has to be something superior. He gives an example from a poem by Juan de Merida, which Fanon, of course, rejects. So we see here that he rejects the Adlerian school of psychology and explains why the psychology of the individual is nothing but nonsense. The next section he goes over is the Hegelian view of the black man. Quote, man is human only to the extent to which he tries to impose himself on another man in order to be recognized by him. As long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other, it is the other who remains the focus of his actions. End quote. What does he mean by this? He states that the white man had recognized his slave, but the slave wants to have himself recognized. By this, he means to be seen as a human being. The opposing views of the basic need to be viewed as human beings and not like an animal that is wild. The slave wants to be seen as human and see themselves as human. They will do anything to do so, but will never be completely seen as human. This is where the dangers of chauvinism begins. Why should one that feels superior give any more recognition to the one they see as inferior? Do they not have enough? We gave them freedom. We gave them the right to marry, to vote, and drive. Isn't that enough? Why can't they be happy? Well, for one to be seen as being worth respect, one must first understand their class setting and the origin of all oppression. The next step is to agitate and educate, then to overthrow and consolidate power, and, most important of all, struggle for unity. He begins chapter 8 with a quote by Karl Marx in his book, The 18th of Brumaire. Quote, the social revolution cannot draw its poetry from the past, but only from the future. It cannot begin with itself before it has stripped itself of all its superstition concerning the past. Early revolutions relied on memories out of world history in order to drug themselves against their own consent. In order to find their own content, the revolutions of the 19th century have to let the dead bury the dead. Before the expression exceeds the content, now the content exceeds the expression. End quote. Karl Marx, The 18th of Brumaire. On the next few pages, Fanon explains something he has found within the intellectual circles of writers, and it is that they suffer from alienation that was created by bourgeois society. Their alienation is to help create a separation from the issues of what the working class face and keeps them ignorant. The bourgeois can use a lot more Foucault, Petersons, Pinkers, and Chomskys, but can do without the Gonzalos, Lenins, Maos, and Engels. Fanon is correct to point out that the bourgeois society stifles progress and advancements, as well as discovery. With every advancement bourgeois society has made from feudal society, it has stifled it to uphold the ruling class interests and form alienation. There is a reason why the science of psychology is plagued with metaphysics. There is a reason why science in our society is so mechanical and not dialectical. It is to uphold the class traditions of a capitalist society. Fanon is again correct to point out that a bourgeois society is a closed one. Only those that conform to the bourgeois ideas will be left empty, as we only reinforce the capitalist society that alienates all of us. Nothing becomes fulfilling. All is temporary and condemned to be forgotten. For one to achieve a well-fulfilled life, one should find a way to serve the people in order to help the revolution. And with that, we've reached the end of the book. Now, there are some things that I did not cover, some of which I did not find important, while some I found would just be repeating myself, and I have done that quite a number of times in this video. Now, what about this book as a whole? I would say that it is a good book, but with some issues. Of course, this is basically Fanon's early work, so it's not like The Wretched of the Earth, which also had some errors, but still good overall. In this book, Fanon used elements of different philosophies, negritude, existentialism, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, yet despite this mixed cesspool of metaphysical thought, we have found ways to extract passages to fit the material and apply dialectics. We can also see Fanon indirectly applying dialectics as well, also purposely, because I also think he also did that on purpose as well. This is a good book for those of you who want to learn about psychology of the colonized and the colonizer. And whilst this lacks a thorough class analysis, I would suggest that people have at least a good understanding of class before reading this piece. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review. I apologize it took this long. School was a thing I had to deal with, and procrastination is another thing that I constantly struggle with. I would like to thank my proofreaders for taking the time to read my script, Your input has been very useful. I don't know when I will post another video, but hopefully you enjoyed this one. If you have questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. This is Mouse98 signing off.